For many viewers, Sara Gilbert will always be remembered as the sharp-tongued, unflinching voice of a working-class American family, a character who grew up on screen while millions grew up watching her. But behind that familiar presence was a life shaped by instability long before fame arrived and burdened by responsibility far earlier than it should have. While the public saw confidence, intelligence, and control, the private reality was far more fragile, marked by fractured family ties, quiet guilt, and emotional survival. This is not a story about celebrity success, but about what it costs to hold everything together when the cracks start forming early. A childhood built on loss and expectation. Sara Gilbert was born into Hollywood, but not into safety. From the outside, her family appeared unusually connected to the entertainment industry, almost destined for creative success. Yet inside the household, stability was fleeting. Her early years were shaped by sudden absence and unresolved grief, beginning with the death of her mother's first husband from a brain hemorrhage, a loss that fractured the family structure long before Sara was old enough to understand it. Not long after, her parents' marriage collapsed, leaving her childhood defined by separation rather than security. Her mother, already immersed in the industry as a producer and talent manager, became both protector and gatekeeper. The home environment blended ambition with pressure, and Sara absorbed early the idea that achievement was not optional. Surrounded by older siblings who were already working actors, especially those finding fame on television, she learned quickly that attention came through performance. Admiration was conditional. Love often felt earned. Even as a child, Sara displayed intense focus and competitiveness, not as a personality quirk, but as a survival instinct. She wanted to belong, to be seen, and to prove she could carry her own weight in a family already shaped by public scrutiny. Acting became less of a dream and more of a necessity, a way to anchor herself in a world that kept shifting around her. By her early teens, she was already working steadily, absorbing adult expectations without the emotional tools to process them. The industry rewarded her maturity, her sharp intelligence, and her restraint. But beneath that composure was a young girl learning too early how to manage other people's needs, while quietly setting her own aside. That pattern, strength first, self later, would follow her for decades. Growing up while the world was watching. When Sara stepped into the role of Darlene on Roseanne, she was barely a teenager, but the character demanded far more than youthful charm. Darlene was sharp, cynical, politically aware, and emotionally guarded, qualities that felt uncannily natural. As the years passed, audiences watched the character mature from a quiet, sarcastic child into a fiercely independent young woman, and Sara was doing the same in real time, without the protection most adolescents rely on. The line between performer and person quietly dissolved. The show's success changed everything. Fame arrived quickly, and with it came expectations that reached far beyond acting. Sara was suddenly navigating professional negotiations, creative influence, and adult responsibility while still forming her own identity. Her role became so central to the show's emotional core that the production itself adjusted around her life, reorganizing schedules so she could attend university while continuing to film. On paper, it looked like empowerment. In reality, it meant never fully stepping away. Critics praised her performance for its honesty and precision, and awards followed, reinforcing the idea that she was exceptional not only for her age but because of it. Yet success carried an invisible weight. Sara was no longer just playing a character growing up under pressure, she was living it. Her intelligence and discipline masked exhaustion, and her composure hid confusion. While peers experimented, failed, and drifted, she remained steady, dependable, and emotionally contained. Behind the scenes, family pressures intensified. Her father's financial decline placed her in an impossible position, forcing her to become a provider before she had even learned how to be a daughter. The money she earned came with emotional strings, and each request strained a bond already weakened by distance and resentment. She wanted a parent, not a dependent, and the guilt of refusing help would linger long after the check stopped. By the time the series ended, Sara was no longer the child audiences remembered. She had grown up under observation, learned to carry silence gracefully, and mastered the art of appearing unaffected. But the cost was clarity. Fame had given her a voice, yet taken away the space to ask who she was becoming without it. Identity, silence, and the cost of holding it in. After the cameras stopped rolling on her most defining role, Sara entered a phase of life that looked quieter from the outside but felt far more destabilizing within. The structure that had governed her adolescence, scripts, schedules, and clear expectations, was suddenly gone. What remained was freedom without a map. For the first time, she had to confront questions she had long postponed, especially the one that followed her most persistently: who she was when no one was watching. Her romantic life became the first place where that uncertainty surfaced. During her teenage years, she had been involved with a co-star, a relationship that seemed ordinary to the public but carried deep internal conflict. On the surface, it fit the expected narrative. Beneath it, something felt wrong in ways she couldn't articulate at the time. She later admitted that affection was often followed by sadness, not clarity. The relationship did not feel dishonest, but it did not feel true either. What made that period especially difficult was the absence of language. Sara did not yet feel able to name her sexuality, even to herself, and the industry around her offered no safe framework for exploration. At a time when public perception shaped careers, uncertainty felt dangerous. So she chose silence, not denial, but postponement. She focused on work, education, and creative control, believing that clarity could wait. But identity does not wait politely. As the years passed, the emotional dissonance grew heavier. Relationships formed, dissolved, and left behind the same unresolved feeling: connection without alignment. Sara began to understand that her discomfort was not situational, but fundamental. Coming to that realization did not bring relief. It brought fear. She worried not only about how the public would respond, but about how disclosure might redefine everything she had already built. That fear shaped her decisions for years. She kept her private life carefully compartmentalized, rarely offering details even when invited. She became articulate, composed, and intellectually sharp in interviews, using insight as armor. The more comfortable she appeared discussing ideas, the more guarded she became about herself. This was not avoidance. It was self-preservation. By the time she was ready to speak openly, the silence itself had already taken a toll. It had shaped her relationships, her self-image, and her sense of belonging. And when she finally chose honesty, it would arrive not as a triumphant reveal, but as a fragile step taken with visible hesitation. Coming out motherhood and the fear of losing everything. When Sara finally chose to speak openly about her sexuality, it did not happen at the height of confidence, but at a moment of deep vulnerability. She came out publicly shortly before launching The Talk, a decision that looked strategic from the outside, but felt terrifying on the inside. She later admitted that even as she spoke with composure, fear followed every word. Not fear of who she was, but fear of what honesty might cost her. By that point, Sara was already a mother. Parenthood reshaped her priorities in ways fame never had. For the first time, success was measured not by recognition, but by presence. She wanted stability, emotional availability, and a life that felt grounded. Yet motherhood arrived while she was still untangling her own identity, creating a quiet tension between self-discovery and responsibility. Her long-term relationship with television producer Ali Adler reflected that complexity. Together, they built a family and shared a life that appeared solid and intentional. But when the relationship ended, the loss cut deeply. Sara spoke openly about the grief, questioning whether long-term partnership was something she could sustain or whether she was fundamentally wired for independence. Watching older couples who had survived decades together filled her with both admiration and doubt. When she later fell in love again and married musician Linda Perry, the shift was sudden and public. The transition brought joy, but also backlash and complicated emotions. Rumors circulated. Old wounds reopened. The past relationship did not fade quietly, and Sara found herself carrying guilt alongside happiness. Even in love, she struggled with the fear that choosing herself meant hurting others. Motherhood intensified that fear. She was determined to shield her children from chaos, from scrutiny, from the instability she had known. Privacy became non-negotiable. While others spoke freely about their spouses and families, Sara drew firm boundaries, insisting on control over her own narrative. She believed that not every truth needed to be public to be valid, yet the pressure of balancing career, family, identity, and public expectation took a physical toll. Exhaustion crept in. Her health slipped. She later acknowledged how easily self-care disappeared under constant obligation, and how even reclaiming a few minutes a day for herself felt like an act of survival rather than indulgence. By this stage of her life, Sara was no longer hiding who she was, but she was still learning how to live with the consequences of finally being seen. When survival requires letting go. By the time Sara's marriage began to unravel, she was already exhausted in ways that success could not disguise. Years of carrying responsibility, professionally, emotionally, and privately, had left little space for recovery. When the separation became unavoidable, it did not arrive as a dramatic rupture, but as a slow realization that love alone was no longer enough to sustain the life they were trying to hold together. Publicly, the language was calm. Privately, the weight was crushing. The end of the marriage forced Sara into an emotional reckoning she could no longer postpone. For years, she had managed pain through discipline and work, but this loss cut through those defenses. She later admitted that the period following the separation was marked by deep psychological strain, one that required intensive therapy and medical intervention. She spoke candidly about undergoing ketamine treatment, not as a cure, but as a release, a way to finally access emotions she had been holding back for decades. What emerged was not instant healing, but clarity. Sara described a moment when the tears stopped, not because the pain vanished, but because it had finally been acknowledged. She rejected the idea that recovery followed a clean narrative arc. Improvement, she said, did not erase struggle. It simply made it survivable. That honesty resonated deeply with audiences who had been taught to expect resilience without cost. At the same time, she made a decisive shift in how she lived her life. Stepping away from daily television was not framed as retreat, but as preservation. She acknowledged that constant visibility had made it impossible to prioritize her children or herself. For the first time, she allowed privacy to outweigh obligation. There was relief in knowing that not every personal challenge had to become public discussion. Professionally, she remained active behind the scenes, shaping stories rather than standing at their center. The work continued, but on her terms. Control became essential, not as power, but as protection. She was no longer willing to sacrifice well-being for productivity. What made this chapter particularly painful was its quietness. There was no scandal to distract from the truth, no external villain to blame. Just the reality that even carefully built lives can collapse under accumulated strain. Sara did not present herself as healed, only honest. She emphasized that growth is not linear, and that survival sometimes means releasing the version of life you once believed you were meant to have. In that admission, she offered something rare, permission to still be struggling even after doing everything right. Legacy, quiet strength, and what remains. Today, Sara's life no longer fits the narrative that once defined her. She is no longer the young prodigy growing up in front of a studio audience, nor the daily presence guiding conversations on daytime television. Instead, she exists in a quieter space, one shaped by intention rather than expectation. Her work continues, but without the urgency that once demanded constant visibility. The absence of noise has allowed something else to emerge: reflection. Looking back, her career tells a different story than the one often assumed. It is not a tale of uninterrupted success, but of endurance. She survived an unstable childhood, entered adulthood before she was ready, and spent years negotiating between public perception and private truth. Each transition required sacrifice. Each reinvention demanded emotional risk, and at every stage, she chose responsibility over comfort. What makes Sara's story particularly painful is not any single event, but the accumulation, the years of silence about her identity, the guilt of family obligations that reversed traditional roles, the fear that honesty could undo everything she had built, the realization that love, even when genuine, does not guarantee permanence. And finally, the acceptance that healing is not a destination, but a continuous process. She has never framed herself as a victim. Instead, she speaks with careful honesty, acknowledging struggle without sensationalizing it. Her openness about therapy and mental health does not seek sympathy. It seeks understanding. In doing so, she challenges a culture that often celebrates resilience without asking what it costs. Sara's legacy is not limited to the characters she played or the shows she helped create. It lives in the permission she gives others to move at their own pace, to set boundaries, and to choose authenticity even when it feels terrifying. Her strength is not loud, it is deliberate. And perhaps that is why it resonates so deeply. In a world that demands constant explanation, Sara Gilbert has chosen something rarer, a life that belongs to her. So after hearing her story, do you see Sara Gilbert differently now, less as a television icon and more as someone who simply survived what many never saw? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear it.